Welcome back to Lend Me Your Ears. This is Chapter 5, Section 8, Peter Arias, his expedition, and remarkable passages of Vascus Nunez. Peter Arias, a knight, embarked on a voyage in the year 1514, accompanied by his wife Elizabeth Bodilla. However, they were caught in a violent storm that resulted in the loss of 2 ships, prompting them to return to Spain. Nevertheless, not long after they embarked on another voyage despite their previous misfortune. They were aware of the hardships endured by Nicuesa, who managed to survive by consuming dogs and other creatures. In fact, a large frog was sold for a lump of gold in Veragua. Vascus Nunez, the governor of Uraba, later known as New Andalusia, learned of Arias's arrival. Intent on enriching himself, before potentially removing areas from power, Nunez discovered the existence of several gold mines south of Uraba. He led a group of 190 men through challenging terrain, including vast rivers, dense thickets, wildlife, filled forests, deep valleys, and wide rivers. They faced numerous hazards and difficulties along the way. In the mountainous territory of Quaraquan, they encountered fierce resistance from the inhabitants, armed with bows, arrows, clubs, wooden swords, pikes, and lances. However, upon hearing the mere sound of the Spaniards' muskets, the natives scattered and fled like flocks of birds. Nonetheless, 600 of them were either killed by the Spaniards or attacked by their specially trained dogs used for warfare in the Americas. Afterward, upon entering the palace, Nunez discovered his brother dressed in women's clothing being kept by the king as a concubine. In abhorrence of the act of sodomy, Nunez ordered his dogs to attack his brother, resulting in his gruesome death. Among the slain, there were several African slaves who had suffered shipwrecks and had been engaged in a continuous war with the Quaraquanan people. It appeared that the deceased Africans found among the natives were their captives. However, Nunez was compelled to leave a significant number of his men behind as they were half-starved and exhausted, unable to continue the journey. With the remaining group, he pressed forward and eventually reached the high mountains from where he caught sight of the vast South Sea. The Spanish commander Nunez encountered King Chiapes, who led an army of 30,000 men. However, the native forces did not put up much resistance and were quickly overwhelmed by the terrifying volleys of gunfire. The echoing valleys amplified the sound, further disheartening and intimidating them. Adding to their dismay, the dogs accompanying the Spanish attacked and tore apart those who tried to flee. Following the battle, the conqueror offered peace, which was accepted upon the delivery of significant amounts of gold as gift. Subsequently, King Chiapes, accompanied by Nunez, crossed a broad river to Cocara. Initially, there was some resistance from the local forces, but they were soon defeated. As a result, they quickly agreed to a peace treaty on the condition that the prince named Coquera would provide a large quantity of gold. In the region, Nunez discovered a picturesque bay with winding reaches that extended over 60 leagues. He named it St. Michael and noted its numerous islands and treacherous hidden rocks. Despite being advised against it by Chiapes, who knew the South Sea's turbulent nature during the final 3 months of the year, Nunez ventured into the offing with 9 Indian boats and 80 men. They reached an uninhabited island, despite the high waves. Forced to spend the night there, they faced the rising tide characteristic of the South Sea, with the highest ground almost submerged. Each Spaniard struggled to avoid being washed away. As dawn broke, they encountered another challenge. The Indian canoes were either extremely leaky or too damaged for use. Despite difficulties, they chose to return, preferring the risk of being swallowed by the waves over the agony of hunger which they had already experienced during their short time at sea. Soon after, Nunez engaged in a field battle and conquered King Tamacus, who subsequently secured peace by offering significant gifts of gold and pearls. He also showed the Spaniards an island, despite it being the middle of October when the turbulent southeast winds create a rough and tumultuous sea. The weather was further exacerbated by constant lightning, thunderclaps, and extreme temperature fluctuations. Nevertheless, Nunez pressed on and reached the island. There he observed how the indigenous people dug for oysters to find pearls. However, due to the rough weather, they were unable to venture far from the shore to obtain the best pearls. Leaving his sick and exhausted men with Chiapes, Nunez chose a different route for his return journey. He crossed a large river and was welcomed by Prince Teaucha, who provided gold, pearls, provisions, and guides to assist with carrying their belongings. Upon hearing of Nunez's approach, Pacra, a notorious oppressor of neighboring tribes, fled. However, he was compelled to return with 3 other deformed princes, resembling horrific monsters with almost no human features. The guides provided by Teacher requested that Nunes execute Acre for his long history of cruelty. Their request was granted, and Nunes fed Pacra and the 3 princes to his Spanish dogs as a grim breakfast. Meanwhile, the Spaniards faced the threat of perishing from lack of water. Eventually, they discovered a small stream in a thicket of brambles, but the Indians were too afraid to approach it due to the presence of tigers and other wild beasts. The Indians recounted stories of tigers snatching people from their huts at night if they failed to secure their doors. John Ledesma himself had eaten part of a tiger that had been feasting on human or animal flesh every night for 6 months. The Spaniards devised a method to capture the tiger by digging a deep pit covered lightly on top. The tiger fell into the trap, but fiercely resisted the pikes, darts, and stones thrown at it, astonishing everyone with its fury. Although they searched for the female tiger, they found only 2 young ones without a mother. They brought the young tigers with them, intending to take them to Spain, but since they had no means of raising them, they eventually decided to retrieve them when they were older. However, upon returning to the den, they discovered it empty, leading them to believe that the cubs had been devoured by their mother. In the province of Bononyama, the Spaniards enriched themselves with chains and breastplates made of abundant gold that hung on the walls of every house. At the river Camogris, they bid farewell to Teaucha's guides and relied on Kotog and Suriza, 2 governors of a barren and mountainous region. They bypassed the hills and mountains, venturing through a marsh for 3 days where they often sank in the mud up to their knees. Throughout their journey, they faced severe scarcity of food, which greatly weakened them. Although they regained some strength upon entering King Bochebua's territory, they found only empty huts. In the country of Curoisus, which had recently been pillaged by more powerful neighboring enemies, Nunes and his men were unable to obtain provisions. However, the locals presented them with heavy gold ingots, which, despite their richness, couldn't buy them any food. They were on the verge of starving when Pocorosa, the Mother King, saved them by providing stamped roots as sustenance for 40 consecutive days. Refreshed and encouraged by Pocorosa, they launched a nighttime attack on Tubonama's palace and captured him along with 80 concubines. Execution, Tubonama's concubines offered an incredible amount of gold as ransom. Enriched by these events, Nunes finally rejoined his people who were stationed on the river Daria, where 2 ships from Hispaniola were anchored. Meanwhile, in America, Peter Arias sailed with 15 ships and 1,500 men to New Andalusia, passing by the islands of Martinina, Guadalupe, and Galanta, all located in America. During their journey, they encountered seaweed-filled seas. Martha's Haven, they faced fierce resistance from the natives. Unfazed by the size of the Spanish ships, the natives waded through the sea up to their chests and showered the Spaniards with a barrage of poisonous arrows, resulting in the immediate death of 2 men. When some of Arias's men ventured ashore, they discovered numerous boats filled with nets made of tough weeds and ropes woven from rushes. St. Martha's Haven, which spans 3 leagues in width, is abundant in fish that can be seen up to 20 fathoms deep in the water. As the Spaniards invaded houses, capturing women and children, the Native Americans prepared for another battle. Initially fierce, they eventually had to retreat. The houses and their furnishings are worth noting. The ceilings are covered with shells strung together, creating a pleasant sound when moved by the slightest breath of wind. The walls are adorned with fine fabrics woven with imagery such as cranes, lions, tigers, and human figures, are covered with multicolored mats made of sea reeds and sturdy roots. Carpets studded with pearls add further beauty to their rooms. In the valleys, the Spaniards discovered precious gems such as sapphires, jasper, emeralds, and large pieces of amber. They also found baskets and chests filled with dried locusts and crabs in some huts. Here the yucca root grows, just like in other West Indian coasts. It is used to make their best bread and is called yuca in Hispaniola and Angola, mandiba and mandioca in Brazil, and guacamole in Mexico. The root has a thick or moderate body depending on the soil's fertility. The leaves resemble those of a tulip, with small flowers and seeds of no practical use. The root, similar to horseradish, contains a milky juice that causes it to swell. The shoots that emerge from the root in the 8th and 10th months are used for new plants, moisture, worms, or ants it leads to severe famine, causing the death of half the inhabitants in that year. The leaves of the mandioca are used for salads. The root is also used to make a kind of flour, which is cooked or roasted, depending on the preference. The root, after soaking in water for 5 days, is used to make meal, known as farina fresca in Portuguese and vipava in the American language. Additionally, mandioca is used to make bread, which is baked over the fire. When mixed with water, pepper, and nambi flour, it creates an excellent pudding known as mingod karim, which is not only delicious, but also nutritious. By combining it with orange flour, water, and sugar, they make a fantastic beverage called tapioca. The powder of mandioca is used to quickly heal wounds. It is fascinating to watch the Americans eat this bread as they throw it by handfuls into their mouths without dropping a single crumb. However, preparing mandioca for bread requires significant skill and effort. First, the shell must be removed, and then it is ground in a mill operated by 2 Indians. The resulting meal falls into a square trough. The juice of mandioca is poisonous when raw but becomes safe to consume when boiled. The meal is pressed to remove moisture and then dried in an oven. The wild mandioca, known as Kuaku mandiiba by those living on the seashore and Kukakukoremia in the countryside, differs in shape and quality from the cultivated variety. Returning to our main topic, Arias anchored in the river Daria and was warmly received by Nunes. His first task was the construction of 3 forts to secure the passages to the South Sea. For this purpose, Joannes Eora was given command over 400 workers. Arias was particularly dissatisfied with a place called Maria Antigua, where the Spaniards were initially compelled to establish their settlement. It was situated in a deep valley between high mountains, lacking the benefits of sunlight and being scorching hot when in or near the meridian. The stagnant, swampy grounds around it contaminated the air, and the water used for washing houses bred frogs instantly. The river Daria caused muddy water to flood the surrounding area up to 3 leagues from the sea. The journey to that place was difficult due to the steep and narrow path through the mountains. Moreover, the journey to Maria Antigua was troublesome due to the uneven and difficult paths, and the presence of tigers and lions posed a threat to both people and livestock. On the first night in Maria Antigua, a house where the surgeon was staying was struck by lightning and caught fire. The surgeon and his wife, who were both burned by the flames, witnessed a large crocodile carrying away their dog towards the river. The nearby territory of Coiba was known for its timber, which, when used for ships, did not attract worms due to its acidity. In contrast, other vessels in the region were prone to this issue. Coiba was also home to plague trees, whose leaves were considered deadly and could kill upon contact, unless the affected area was immediately anointed with fasting spit. The Coibenses claimed to know of another poisonous wood that they used to eliminate their enemies. While Arias was deliberating on these matters, he dispatched several commanders to different locations to explore and report back on their findings. One of them, Gaspar Morales, was tasked with heading towards the South Sea to solidify the peace agreement initiated by Nunes with the King's Chief and Tumacas. Morales was specifically instructed to go to the Pearl Island with 60 men, which Nunes had been forced to abandon due to harsh weather. Chiapas and Tumacas were expected to assemble an army ready to assist Morales upon his arrival. Despite lacking sufficient vessels, their largest could only carry a few men. They managed to land 70 men on the island. The inhabitants, led by their king, rushed to meet the newly arrived forces, shouting Guazavara, Guazavara, and attacking with their wooden swords. However, the gunfire and the combination of fire, smoke, and bullets quickly overwhelmed them. The king fled, hoping to rally all the islanders, but upon realizing that no one could withstand the firepower of the Spaniards, they negotiated a treaty with Morales. As part of the agreement, they agreed to provide 100 pounds of the finest pearls for the use of the King of Castile. As a sign of friendship, the king was baptized as Peter Arias, adopting the name of the governor of New Andalusia. The magnitude of the treasure brought back by Morales from the Pearl Island is evident from one of the pearls, for which Pope Leo X paid 44,000 ducats to a Venetian merchant. Among the commanders sent out by Arias was Johannes Solicius, who sailed 600 leagues south along the Caribbean coast beyond Cape St. Augustine. He discovered that the inhabitants of Pernambuc were not only cruel but also cunning. Upon being invited ashore, Solicius and some of his men rowed there, only to be killed and eaten in the presence of the other sailors on board. Shocked by this horrific sight, they quickly weighed anchor and sailed away, carrying only Brazil wood to Cadiz. Unfortunately, Johannes Pontius also had a tragic encounter when he sent some of his laundresses ashore on Guadalupe Island to wash linen for him. The islanders suddenly emerged from the woods, ambushed them, and mercilessly killed them. They proceeded to cut their bodies into pieces and grilled the flesh over coals, consuming it while still hot. Meanwhile, Gonçalves Badajoz sailed with 80 men westerly after sailing 60 leagues. They disembarked and spent several futile days attempting to establish friendly relations with the local Americans. During this time, they were joined by 50 men from Daria, led by Lodowick Mercado. Together, they decided to journey across the mountains to reach the South Sea. Gogolwa, known for his abundant gold reserves, had fled with most of his treasure and was never heard from again. However, they captured some of his slaves, whose faces were intricately carved with sharp fish bones. The wounds were filled with red and black powder, permanently discoloring the flesh. After traveling through the wilderness for 5 consecutive days, they encountered Indians carrying maize, who informed them about King Periguet along the seashore and the blind Totonaga further inland. Both tribes possessed an invaluable treasure trove of gold. One particular piece weighed 2 pounds. In this expedition, Tarakura amassed 18,000 pounds of gold. They also acquired a similar amount from the territories belonging to the princes Panasnome, Tabor, Cheru, and Scoria. As they couldn't carry all the gold themselves, they utilized the prisoners as carriers. Each soldier, even the lowest-ranking ones, received over 3,000 pounds sterling as their share. They had now reached Panza's kingdom, but not without leaving behind a dark reputation for their greed and cruelty. When Parasa launched a fierce attack on this gold-laden group, 70 of them were killed in the initial assault. The few survivors returned to Peter Arias to deliver the news of their tragic loss. Among those who escaped was Franciscus de la Puente, who had interesting observations about capturing parrots and wild fowl. To lure the parrots, an Indian would climb a tree and mimic their chattering and calls, enticing them to approach and allow him to catch them in his hands. Capturing wild fowl like geese, ducks, and swans was a different process. In the standing pools and lakes of the region, weeds would grow at the bottom. These weeds would ripen and decompose, attracting waterflies, spiders, and frogs, which the birds would feed on. In the nearby gardens there were cabbage plants that grew as tall as trees. The falling cabbage leaves served as both nests and food for the birds. However, skilled fowlers found a clever method to catch them. They hollowed out one of these cabbages, placed it on their head like a helmet, waded into the water up to their chin, and stealthily approached the birds. With only the floating cabbage visible, they would seize the birds one by their legs and store them in a bag tied around their waist for that purpose. Another noteworthy bird in the region was the American toucan Exocheta nerchate, characterized by its fleshy bill resembling a mouthful of teeth that continually opened and closed for breathing since it had no nostril. Its back, neck, and wings were black, its breast golden yellow, and its belly and tail tip vermilion. The toucan primarily fed on pepper, which quickly passed through its digestive system. The locals highly valued the pepper excreted by the bird since it mellowed the unpleasant sharpness and biting quality. Returning to the story, while the expeditions led by Peter Arias faced setbacks, Arias himself and Vacius Nunes encountered a conflict between them. Vacius Nunes, who had gained some recognition at the Spanish court for his discovery of the South Sea, had constructed 4 ships on the shores. However, he was ordered to come before Governor Arias and was subsequently imprisoned. He was accused of high treason, alleging that he had intentions to establish himself in Peru and had abandoned Daria, despite vehemently denying these accusations. During his trial and having no witnesses to testify against him, Arias ordered his execution by beheading. Shortly thereafter, Lucas Sosa, the governor of the Canary Islands, was appointed to replace Arias in New Andalusia. Section 9. The expeditions of Francisco Fernandez, Lupus Caicedos, Cristofero Morantes, Bernardo Igniguez, and Juan Grisalva. Fernandez, Caicedos, and Morantes, who were established settlers in Cuba, obtained a license from Governor Diego Velázquez to equip 3 ships and gather a crew of 110 men for the purpose of discovering new lands. Vasques decided to add one more person to their group on behalf of the king and entrusted Igniguez with this responsibility. They sought the guidance of the experienced navigator Antonio Alamines. After 6 days at sea, they spotted land, which they mistakenly called Yucatan because the inhabitants, when asked about the name of the coast, responded with Yucatan, which, as the Spaniards later discovered, meant "we don't understand you." Upon reaching the shore, they encountered a city characterized by impressive stone buildings, grand facades, and tall towers. Due to its remarkable size, Fernandez named this city Cairo, after the renowned Egyptian capital. The Spaniards were warmly received and escorted into the city. They marveled at the cleanliness of the marketplaces, the well-organized streets, and the luxurious clothing worn by both men and women. Their amazement grew when they came across elaborately crafted crosses. Inquiring about them, they were told that a man more glorious than the sun had died while erecting these crosses. However, despite the initial hospitality, the natives seemed to grow weary of the Spaniards' presence after a few days. Sensing this change, the Spaniards decided to retreat and continued westward in pursuit of their intended goal. They eventually anchored before Campechium, where the king welcomed Fernandez, Morantes, and some others into the city, which consisted of 3,000 houses. In the king's palace, they were treated to a feast of various roasted birds. After this refreshment, they explored the city, where they encountered several remarkable structures, including a tall square marble theatre. Atop the theatre was a statue of a man, surrounded on each corner by 4 wild beasts, all of which had strange and terrifying appearances. They discovered a serpent made of chalk and small stones, with a coiled tail measuring 47 feet in length and corresponding thickness. This serpent, stained with warm human blood, appeared to be preying on a marble lion. Both the serpent and the lion were enclosed within a stone railing, and it was here that criminals were executed daily. Broken bows and arrows stained with blood were scattered among the bones and corpses. Igniguez and his companions observed all of these astonishing sights. The king of Moscobo was named Lazarus, as he discovered his country on St. Lazarus's Day. After a short stay there, they returned to their ship and sailed 50 leagues further west. The fleet then sighted Moscobo in the Aguanil territory, where the king fiercely attacked the Spaniards, resulting in the death of 22 men and almost all others being wounded. Their expedition yielding unfavorable results, they returned to Cuba. However, Velasquez remained undeterred and soon equipped 4 vessels with a crew of 300 men under the command of Juan Grisalva and Alamines. They sailed 70 leagues and discovered the fertile island of Cozumel. Along its shores, they found beautiful stone buildings interspersed with temples, whose steeples rose above the houses. Grisalva, guided by a priest, climbed one of these steeples and spotted the territory of Yucatan in the distance. Within the halls of the temple there were numerous marble and stone statues depicting deformed men and beasts. The island was named Sancta Cruz by the Spaniards. Continuing their journey, they set course for Campechianum, where they had received friendly treatment the previous year. However, upon their arrival, the attitude of the Campechians had drastically changed. They informed the Spaniards that they would not allow any strangers among them, placing a burning torch between their forces. The Campechians forcefully attacked the Spaniards, who had come ashore without fear. As the Spaniards approached their battlements, the Campechians unleashed a fierce onslaught. Realizing their advantage, the Spaniards unleashed a volley of small shots that struck fear into their opponents. The Campechians fled, seeking safety within the city. Subsequently, the Spaniards discovered that Yucatan was only a peninsula, and they reached its shores. They arrived at a river named Grisalva, which flowed with such a strong current into the Mexican Sea that its water remained fresh for 2 leagues. Along the banks of this river stood over 6,000 Native Americans, and 100 armed men in boats approached the Spanish ships. The interpreters from Cuba, who could communicate with the Tabascans due to their similar language, facilitated trade negotiations. The king of Tabasco himself approached Commander Grisalva and exchanged gold for the weight of his iron helmet, breastplate, and other armor. Afterward, they landed on the island of Sacrifice, named so due to the horrifying daily sacrifices performed by its inhabitants. Among the various peculiar statues, there stood a large marble lion with a deep gash into which warm human blood was poured. The blood flowed into a stone trough. Placed beneath and a carved alabaster figure of a man leaned forward, seemingly looking into the trough at the blood. The sacrifices were prisoners captured from neighboring coasts, brought before their idols, and had their hearts ripped out. The blood-smeared lips of the idols were then thrown into the fire. The heads and bodies of the sacrificed individuals were left unburied, and their flesh, particularly their cheeks, was consumed. The next island was inhabited by women. Annually, their neighbors would visit them under the pretense of friendly gestures, but with amorous intentions. They would plow, till the land, and tend to their gardens. The main city of Tabasco Pontentianum was home to over 1,500 houses, all built with hardened stone using their unique baking method. The city, with its turrets and temples, provided a pleasant and picturesque view from a distance. The Spaniards also observed 14 other notable towns in Tasco. When the Spaniards engaged in conversations with the locals, they were astonished by their peculiar way of sealing agreements and contracts. Instead of using wax, the natives sealed their deals with their own blood, which they drew using a stone knife from their tongue, hand, or arms. The priests among them lived celibate lives, and if found to be unchaste, they were punished with death. Adulterous women were sold as slaves. Unmarried individuals were not allowed to have frequent interactions with married people. They observed a Lent period of 35 days in a year, during which they abstained not only from meat, but also from fish, consuming only roots and herbs. The Spaniards were received in grandeur in this place, with a canopy made of green palm tree branches. They were escorted back to their ships in a similar manner, accompanied by numerous presents including intricately crafted gold effigies of a man. With these gifts, they returned to Cuba. Section 10. The expedition of Ferdinand Magellan, commonly called Magellani. The Bishop Bartholomew de Cassis, living a considerable time in Hispaniola, in the city Dominico, being informed of the abundance of pearls that were caught before Cubagua, and the unsupportable cruelty of the Spaniards there under Ocampus, used against the inhabitants, went to Spain with a design to obtain from the Emperor Charles V the government over Cumana and Cubagua, under the pretense of drawing the ignorant natives from their idolatry to Christianity. This request was especially promoted by William of Nassau, the emperor's prime favorite. So, having his letters patents granted to that purpose, he took ship and arrived with 300 Spanish gentlemen of quality in Cumana. And to have greater respect shown to them there, they each had a red cross given to them, such as the knights of Calatrava generally wear. Ocampus, the old governor of Cumana, regard either them or their authority. Instead of receiving and submitting, he kept the Bishop de Cassis out by force of arms. The bishop then made a complaint to the Viceroy of the West Indies in Hispaniola, and in the meantime put his cargo into a new storehouse. But while he made his addresses, Ocampus, having sufficiently enriched himself, departed, which encouraged the Cumaners, who were already incensed and weary of their former sufferings, to venture on a plan whereby they might revenge themselves. Successful, that very few escaped the massacre. Upon learning of this, de Cassis, being informed and greatly discontented, retreated to a Dominican cloister in Hispaniola. Yet not long after, the Cumaners paid dearly for that slaughter. Juan Castellio, though not without several engagements with various success, lasting 40 days together, having finally utterly vanquished them, put them to an ignominious death by hanging up 70 of their princes and showing little mercy to those of lower rank. Similarly, Lodowick Lampagnano had little success. He was sent out by some Spanish merchants, with patents from the emperor to fish for pearls. Before the same Cubagua, he carried specific nets and other necessities with him. This Magallanes, or Magellanus, a gentleman of Portugal, having performed things of great importance for his king in Africa, although with no less trouble than charge, desired an addition of half a ducat a month to his annual pension. An inconsiderable sum to make a request for, yet so little, was niggardly denied, whereupon, highly incensed, he studied no little revenge, to which effect Sal on after an opportunity was presented, by means of Franciscus Serenus, who wrote from Ternate to him that he should speedily come thither, which he soon after did upon this account. Pope Alexander VI, having fixed terminaries between the kings of Castile and Portugal, both busy at that time in discovering new countries, ordered that Castile should possess all the coasts lying to the west of the chief meridian, and Portugal to the east. Rich and spicy Molucca Islands fell absolutely to the Portuguese. Now Magallanes persuaded Charles V that they might be sailed to with a westerly course and therefore belonged to Castile. Magallanes sailed afterwards southerly along America to 42 degrees southern latitude, and was engaged with the eddyings of a very strong current, which drove one of the ships into a bay, splitting against a blind rock. But the men saved in their boat were driven farther and farther into a channel between high and snowy mountains. Magallanes immediately judged, as the famous necromancer Roderick Talerus had often told him, that there was a passage through which the northern ocean flowed into the southern. But Magallanes entered the Great South Sea with 3 sails on the 25th of October, where the seamen suffered extremely from excessive heat, drought, and famine for 3 months and 20 days without sight of land. But sailing to the Molucca Islands with the other 2, they freighted them both with cloves. The ship Trinitas sailed to New Spain through the South Sea, and the Victoria, commanded by John Sebastian Delano, went the same way that the Portuguese used, and then to St. Lucar de Barrameda near Seville, where he came to anchor with his ship and 18 men. The occasion of this was out of revenge, because the Spaniards had fallen too foul upon their women and maids, deflowering and forcing them to their pleasure, of which nothing was more detestable among them. The seamen, weakened by these misfortunes, were forced to burn their 3rd ship, called St. Jago. But the king, in his own defence, encountered Magallanes, slew him and 7 more Spaniards, besides 22 dangerously wounded. Those who escaped by flight went to Zubo, where, being invited to dinner by the king, they were all murdered at the table instead of a second course. The king of Zubo freely submitted himself to the Spaniards, and Magallanes, leaving his fleet at anchor in the haven, went with his own and other Indian boats, attended by some of the Zubo people, to Matan. There, setting a village on fire, he carried great riches from there. This did not satisfy him, and he resolved within 8 days to set upon the royal head city. The chief island, called Borneo, has 254 leagues in circumference, on which a tree grows whose leaves, when fallen off, seem to be alive and creep like worms. The king of this island entertained the Spaniards very courteously, with 2 elephants bringing his presents to them on the shore, out of a city consisting of 20,000 houses. Near Borneo are 2 lesser islands called Zubo and Matan. And now their shoes and the leather that covered their shields began to grow scarce, which before had been considered a delicacy, when they discovered 2 islands lying 200 leagues apart, both desolate and barren, hence called the Unfortunate Isles. After that they came amongst a great number of islands whose inhabitants were much inclined to thievery, for which reason they denominated them Ladrones. Therefore he resolutely ventured to sail into those straits, which, in some places narrow and in others broad, is 120 leagues long and full of small isles and dangerous rocks. While he continued to sail on, the ship called Antonio, tacking about, returned. While he lay in that harbour, which was called St. Julian, he cashiered his vice-admiral John Carthagena with his father confessor, and spared their lives, setting them ashore to seek their fortunes, though they had conspired to murder him. Charles V considered and approved this advice, and rigged out 5 ships, with which Magallanes set sail from Seville on the 10th of August, 1519. For 5 months he plied up and down the coast inhabited by the Patagons, where he found none but 1 single person, or rather a monster, a giant 10 feet high, who came aboard his ship and devoured a great hamper full of biscuits, and drank up 9 bottles of water in 1 draught. He also saw several trees that had been hewn with axes, and crosses made on the tops of them, but the Cubagawan Spaniards unanimously withstood him, so he was unable to accomplish his design. Overwhelmed with a melancholy distemper that broke his heart, he died. In the interim, while these scarce and considerable voyages turned into such a small account, Ferdinand Magallanes, for so Peter Martyr calls him, and not Magellanus, which herein deserves to be credited because they were intimately acquainted and had a great friendship between them, undertook to sail around the world, the occasion of which we will here relate at large. This will conclude this chapter. Thank you for lending me your ears. Stay tuned for chapter 6.